In the following weeks, we are going to be learning how to use the tools and methods of logic to evaluate people's answers to Socrates' second question, what is your evidence? We are also going to be using the tools and methods of logic to help you construct your own strong answers to Socrates' question, what is your evidence? Before we continue, though, let's have a little review. Socrates' first question, what exactly do you mean by that? Is a question that Socrates asked to try to get his interlocutors to define their terms clearly and precisely, specify their claims, again, clearly and precisely, and then he asked questions to test and examine those definitions, looking for inconsistencies and other holes and flaws in the definitions. Socrates' second question, what is your evidence, should be answered with an argument. Evidence for a claim should be presented in the form of an argument. In philosophy, an argument is not a disagreement or a quarrel between two people. An argument is a technical term with a very specific definition. An argument is a set of statements where statements are declarative sentences, sentences that can be true or false. Not all sentences are statements. Questions are not statements. Commands are not statements. Exclamations are not statements. An argument is a set of statements. Some of those statements are premises. One of the statements is the conclusion, where the premises are intended to support the conclusion. An argument is a set of statements, premises, and conclusion, where the premises are intended to support the conclusion. Again, premises are statements given as evidence to support another statement, the conclusion. When a person makes an argument, they are claiming that their premises imply the conclusion. Or to say the same thing in a different way, they are claiming that the conclusion follows from the premises. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true as well because it follows from the premises. When a person makes an argument, they are making an inference from the premises to the conclusion. An inference is a logical step that a reasoner makes. A reasoner reasons from the premises to the conclusion. They make an inference, a logical step from premises to conclusion. That gives us our full definition of an argument. An argument is composed both of statements, premises, conclusion, and of inferences from the premises to the conclusion. So again, the technical definition of an argument is a set of statements, premises, and conclusion, and inferences from the premises to the conclusion. Here's an example of an argument. It is a paraphrase of a famous argument from the philosopher René Descartes. Descartes argues that his senses sometimes deceive him. For example, he sees an optical illusion, his senses are deceiving him. He reasons, if my senses deceive me about some things, they could be deceiving me about everything. From these two premises, that his senses sometimes deceive him, and that if his senses deceive him sometimes, they could deceive him all the time, Descartes concludes, everything I perceive with my senses could be an illusion. So Descartes arguing that premise 1 combined with premise 2 imply that everything he sees, hears, feels, tastes, smells could be an illusion. Here's another example of an argument, this time from Socrates. This argument is paraphrased from Plato's Apology. Socrates argues that to fear death is to believe that death is a great evil. So if you're afraid of death, you think death is something evil. Premise 2, Socrates says, but no one knows what happens when you die. Premise 1, combined with premise 2, leads Socrates to the conclusion that to fear death is to think you know something when you do not. And as you all know, Socrates claims never to think he knows something when he does not know it, and so this is Socrates' argument also for why he does not fear death. So the two example arguments that I've given you have been fairly simple, 2 premises, and I have identified the premises and the conclusion for you. Usually when you're reading an argument, you're gonna have to identify the conclusion and the premises for yourself. So here's another argument that's not done for you. Since the gods love what they think is just and hate the opposite, but they disagree about what actions are just or unjust, some gods will love actions that other gods hate. So here's an argument. The premises and conclusion are not identified for you, and something else to observe, this argument is 1 sentence long, meaning that the premises and the conclusion are all combined in one single sentence. But still, it's an argument. So your job, what is the conclusion? First step, identify the conclusion. Which statement in this sentence is the conclusion of the argument? If you said, some gods will love actions that other gods hate, you are correct. That is the conclusion of the argument. Your next job then is to identify which statements in this sentence are the premises of the argument. Here's a hint. There are 2. This argument has 2 premises. What are they? Premise 1, the gods love what they think is just and hate the opposite. Premise 2, the gods disagree about what actions are just or unjust. So when you come across an argument, there are certain words that can help you identify which statements are the premises. Certain words or phrases, we call them premise indicators, are clues or signals that the following statement is a premise. Here are some examples of premise indicators. Because, since, given that. Can you think of other premise indicators? Other words help you find the conclusion of an argument, and not surprisingly, we call these conclusion indicators. Therefore, as a result, so, it follows that. Can you think of other conclusion indicators? Premise and conclusion indicators are very useful parts of sentences and arguments that can help you figure out which statements are meant to be the premise, the evidence, the support, and which statement is meant to be the conclusion that the person is arguing for. In your own writing, you can help your reader understand your argument by using premise and conclusion indicators as well. So the arguments we've been talking about so far have been very simple arguments. They've moved right from the premises to the conclusion. They have had only one inference. Most of the arguments that you will read not only in philosophy, but in the newspaper or in your other classes. And most of the arguments that you make will be more complex arguments. Complex arguments are composed of more than one simpler argument. So complex arguments build bigger arguments out of smaller arguments. So complex arguments move from basic premises to intermediate conclusions to a final conclusion. Or another way of saying the same thing, complex arguments have more than one inference. I think it's useful to understand complex arguments if you kind of see it in a picture or diagram form. So let's take a look at this diagram of a complex argument. If you look at it, you see that here we have some basic premises, BP for basic premises. So we start with these premises. If we have souls that live on after the death of our bodies and brains, then these souls must think and feel. First basic premise. Second basic premise. Souls are immaterial, non-physical. So this basic premise, it's useful to notice, is a definition of souls. Third basic premise. Brains are material, physical things. From these three basic premises, basic premise 1, basic premise 2, and basic premise 3, the reasoner makes an inference to this intermediate conclusion, that if we have souls that live on after the death of our bodies and brains, then we must not need our brains to think, since the souls must think and feel. So, from these three premises, it follows that the intermediate conclusion is true. Then the reasoner, making this argument, combines this intermediate conclusion with another basic premise, that it would be impossible to think without a brain, and from this premise and this premise infers their final conclusion: we do not have souls that live on after the death of our body brains. So a few things about this argument to pay attention to. The intermediate conclusion is still a premise of the argument. The intermediate conclusion is still a statement being offered in support of the final conclusion. We also notice that several premises are combined together to support a conclusion or an intermediate conclusion or a conclusion. So here we have these premises, which all combined together are supposed to imply the intermediate conclusion, and here we have this intermediate conclusion combined with this basic premise, which is supposed to imply the final conclusion. So to define some of these terms, a basic premise is a premise in an argument that is asserted without support. So if we go back and look at our complex argument here, we'll see that this premise, this premise, this premise, and this premise are all being asserted by the person making the argument without any additional support. The person is just asserting that these things are true. In this case, they're offering a definition of souls. So, basic premises are premises in an argument that are asserted without support. Intermediate conclusions, on the other hand, are still premises, but these premises are supposed to both follow from other premises and imply another conclusion. So again, if we take a look at our argument, we see that this intermediate conclusion is supposed to follow from these basic premises, but it also, when combined with this basic premise, leads to another conclusion, the final conclusion. So to review, basic premises is a premise in an argument that is asserted without support. Intermediate conclusions are still premises, but they are supposed to both follow from other premises and imply a further conclusion. Let's take a look again at our argument. One last thing to point out is that this argument, the whole argument, with all of its premises and conclusion, is made up of two sub-arguments. The first sub-argument is the argument from basic premise 1, basic premise 2, basic premise 3 to the intermediate conclusion. So it's this inference from these premises to the conclusion. The second sub-argument is here. It's the intermediate conclusion, this basic premise, and the inference from this intermediate conclusion and basic premise to the final conclusion. So two sub-arguments. Each sub-argument has premises, an inference, and a conclusion. Premises, an inference, and a conclusion. The main argument, this whole thing, is made up of two sub-arguments. Okay. So, we're talking here about Socrates' second question, what is your evidence? To review, the answer to Socrates' second question, what is your evidence, should be presented in the form of an argument. Arguments are a set of statements. Some of those statements are the premises. The premises are statements intended to support another statement. The conclusion. When somebody makes an argument, they are saying that the premises imply the conclusion, or same thing in a different way, the conclusion follows from the premises. Premise and conclusion indicators are signal words or clue words that help readers identify which statements are premises and which statements are conclusions. In your own writing, you should use premise and conclusion indicators to help your reader identify the premises and conclusion of your own argument. Some arguments are simple arguments. Simple arguments move directly from one or more premises to the conclusion. They have only one inference. Most arguments are not simple arguments. Most arguments are complex arguments. Complex arguments are made up of sub-arguments. That is, complex arguments use smaller arguments to build a larger argument. Complex arguments have intermediate conclusions, which are premises of an argument that follow from other premises and lead to further conclusions. Basic premises are the premises of an argument that are asserted without any support. The author just asserts that these are true without giving them further support. And that's it. This is the end of lesson 1. You should be able to define and use and understand all of these terms in both identifying arguments that other people make and in making your own arguments, both simple arguments and complex arguments.